So in this video, we are going to continue working on our game servers. So what we need to be able to do is in our game servers, we need some sort of class that represents a currently running game. In addition to that, we also need to have data in our database that indicates which games are currently running, which players are currently part of which game, and so on. We need this for a variety of reasons. For example, if a person were to abandon a game or leave a game, not abandon, just, their client crashed or whatever, we need to be able to tell them that, hey, you're currently in a game, and would you like to rejoin, or would you like to completely abandon it? So before we can start generating the IDs of our games, that's another issue that we're going to have to resolve, we also need to be able to insert a row into a database table for that particular game to get a unique ID. So if you recall, in our BuzzMMO server master, in our game lobby system, when we begin a game, we need to tell or we retrieve the information from our region server as to what ID of the game it is. So if you check out right here, we have our game instance, and the game instance has an ID. So we need a way to generate that. And to do that, we need database entities. So the first thing we're going to do in this video is start to take a look at how our database schema is going to look like. And it's actually going to be very straightforward. So we're going to primarily have three entities that we need to write. We need to write an entity that represents a particular game server. Now, fortunately, we already have an ID for our game server. If you recall, our game servers have these GUIDs attached to them so that we can uniquely identify each individual game server globally. So we're going to have a row for each one of the game servers that's registered or has registered with the new unique ID. We need a game, some sort of game entity that represents a currently running game, and then we need a bridge between a game entity and a player entity or a user entity to indicate which users are in which games, what parameters were set, what team, what hero were they, and so on, so that when they rejoin, they have all that proper information. So to do that, we're going to jump over into our data project, and we're going to hop over into entities. We'll start off by doing our game server entity. So I'm going to go over to entities, create a new class. It's going to be called game server entity. Game server entity is going to have I'm going to try to make, I've never actually tried this before. I'm going to try to make a GUID as the primary key. Entity Framework will pick up on this property being the primary key because it has the name of ID. And then we'll have a public virtual string name. And how about just a public virtual date time created at. I'm not going to worry about replicating the other information such as the address or the application name or anything like that. That's kind of irrelevant because we have that information from our config. And we want to be able to change that information from our config files and not have to worry about propagating those changes to the database. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and run our migration. So I'm going to go open up my package manager console, which for some reason is very big. And I'm going to switch my, how do I do this? I believe so I'm going to switch my default project over to buzzmmo.data, but then I'm going to leave the startup project as buzzmmo.web. And what that'll do is when I run the migration script, it'll use the connection string that I have set right here to compare the database, and it'll generate the proper migration. So all we have to do is say add-migration, and the name of this will just be game server entity. Let's see if this works. See, I don't think I've ever used a GUID as a primary key in Entity Framework using MySQL before. So we'll see what happens when we do this. It seems to, blah, 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 don't care. It seems to have done a whole lot of nothing. Oh, right. Let's go ahead and delete that. The reason I didn't do anything is because I didn't attach this this class to our DB context. So if we open up our MMO database context, make sure you come down here and say public DB set, and then pass in the name game server entity, and we'll just call this game servers with the public getter and a public setter. So with that, let's jump back into the package manager console and let's rerun that add migration script. It should be a little bit more interesting now. It should actually do something at this point, and it does. So as you see, we do indeed now have a migration with that set. So I'm interested what's going to happen here when I run update database. So update database will apply this migration to my testing database. And it looks like we have a build error somewhere. That's interesting. What are you yelling at? Blah, 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 blah. Ooh. Okay, I'm deleting this. Okay, so that's a fun little thing. The name game server entity for the migration is conflicting with the actual entity game server entity. So I'm going to delete the migration again, and I'm going to rerun my add migration. I'm going to say add game server entity table. I usually like. I know I'm being inconsistent with add and create here, but I usually like putting a verb in those migrations anyway. I don't know why I didn't before. All right, so let's run update database. That should apply to my testing database. Hopefully it doesn't fail. It doesn't fail, but I'm curious to see what data type it decided to use. So I'm going to go ahead and pop open my database real fast. And I have it open. And then I'm going to hop over into game server entities, and I'm just going to say alter table. So it... Okay, so I guess this is what it's doing. It is creating our primary key. It did set it as the primary key, which is correct and not null, but it's doing a char of 36. So it's going to be storing our GUIDs as a string, and that's fine. It's a little bit more wasteful than if it were using binary, but I guess this is just what we have to live with Entity Framework, MySQL, and GUIDs. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and write the code that's going to be responsible for inserting these entities. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my BuzzMMO server region. And I guess in the application, when we establish our configuration, or how about before we do, during setup, I want to go ahead and open a connection to the database, check to see if a row already exists for this particular region server, and if it doesn't, go ahead and insert it, and if it does, go ahead and update the name if the name changed. So yeah, let's go ahead and do that. I do believe I have a reference to buzzmmo.data, and I do. I don't know if I have a connection string, actually. We don't have a connection string yet. Let's write the code first, and then we'll bring in the connection string, because then we'll have something to test against. Okay, for setup, I'm going to simply say var, or using var database equals new MMO database context. This will establish a connection to the database. And then I'm going to say var server equals database dot game servers, and then I'm just going to... I'm just going to say game servers find? Yeah, it's find. Game servers find, and then I'm going to find on our config dot, or our application dot config dot ID, or that's going to be game server dot unique ID. I do believe find will return null. Blah, blah, blah. Otherwise, the request is made... finds an entity with a given, if an entity with a given parameter exists in the context, return immediately, blah, blah, blah. If no entity is found, then null is returned. So good. So now we can say if server is null, then I'm going to say server equals new game server entity. And I'm going to say created at is datetime.utc now. Always use UTC now for this sort of thing. ID will be application .config.gameserver.uniqueID, and name will be application config game server name. Let's move created that to the bottom there. Okay, so now we have server, and then I can simply do game servers database to game servers add server, and then I can do else. Actually, I'm going to invert this. So I'm going to say if server is not null, then simply say server.name equals application config game server name database say changes, and then if it is null, then go ahead and add it to the database. Okay, I'm noticing that I'm accessing config.gameserver a lot, so I'm going to go ahead and highlight this right here. You could highlight it up here if you wanted to, and hit Control-Shift-R, and simply say introduce variable. And I'm going to replace all 5 occurrences, and I'm going to call this server config. So that just shortens our code up just a little bit by aliasing out that into a local variable. I kind of like that style there a little bit more. Anyway, at this point, it's still not going to work. It's not going to work because we haven't set up our configuration for our connection string. So if you recall, the MMO database context is going to, if we pop that open, we're instructing Entity Framework to use the MMO database connection string attached to our app.config. So to make this work, all we got to do is jump into our app.config and add a connection string. So the first thing I'm going to do is format that. And then I always like my connection strings to be at the top. Of course, in an app.config, you can't put anything before the config sections element. So right after the config sections element, I'm going to do connection strings. And then I'm just going to be lazy and jump over into buzzmmo.web, web.config, and I'm just going to grab this entire connection string that we already have on our website, and I'm just going to paste it right there. So yeah. And again, we will find out, we'll work on a better way to deal with configuration stuff like this. What I would really want to do actually is have our configuration stuff, all of our configuration stuff handled by environment variables. But right now we're just going to be taking advantage of these app.configs. So if again, since we're able to do transforms, also we removed debug Nelson, so I can delete that. For the release build, we could put in our transform there if we wanted to, but we're not deploying quite yet, so I'm not too entirely concerned about it. So anyway, make sure that you add that connection string, and then one more look at the code here is pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and hit F6. And I already have the master server and one of my game servers running. So once this finishes, I'm going to go ahead and start my second game server. Start a service. And then I'm going to hop over, well, first I'm going to, I'm checking my logs, I'm not seeing any errors. So that's a good sign. So let's go ahead and hop open our game server entities. I'm going to open table. And it, oh. Now, the issue that I have here is I never called database.savechanges after we did the add. I only did it to update the name if it changed. So I'm going to go ahead and take database save changes, move it down there, hit F6, and then just wait a moment. So hopefully we're getting some action here. I'm not seeing anything in the logs. Let me try hitting F6 a little harder here. Check the database. I just forget what the... just right-click open table, whatever. Or maybe close it, open table. We're still not getting anything. It's not restarting is the problem. It's not automatically restarting, so that's a little disappointing here. Let's just go ahead and force it to restart. So I'm going to say restart service on game instance 1, and then wait an hour and a half for Photon control to let me say start service on game instance 2. So now we should just wait here. And are we getting anything for the Photon CLR? Just a attempted access and unloaded domain. That's not a big concern. It seems like our services are really not wanting to start. That's interesting. Let me go ahead and clear out all of my logs. I kind of want to figure this out. So clear out all my logs, hit start service. While that does its thing, I'm going to go ahead and hop over into where I have Photon installed at, which is right there. And I'm going to pop open my logs. I'm going to make sure I have my Photon CLR. That is my Photon CLR log. And I'm also going to open up my game instance 1 here. And okay, we're getting exceptions here. That's why it's not starting. So again, I did this by opening up the bin Win64, open up logs, go into our game instance 1 and game instance 2 logs. And if you notice at the bottom, it says service shutdown complete. If there's an exception when starting up a server for the first time, Photon will just kill the entire process. If you restart a server and there's an exception, then Photon will not do that. But anyway, we can see no entity framework provided for the invariant. Okay. That's an easy fix. That's just because in my app.config, I'd forgotten to provide the MySQL data adapter, but it's right there, which is interesting. So let's do some science. Let's compare this app.config with our web.config, because we know our web.config works. So we know that works. That's weird. Add MySQL data provider. And then delete it, and then add it again. That's an interesting thing there. What's the difference between these two? MySQL data, MySQL client factory. MySQL data, so the other one uses a strong name and this one doesn't. So we can I can go ahead and nuke that, I guess. But Okay, we need a provider. That's what we need. So as you see up here, we have our MySQL data, MySQL client provider in the providers underneath Entity Framework. So come down here, come to Entity Framework providers, and then after SQL client, add MySQL data.client. So just go ahead and copy basically this section over into here. Also, I'm actually going to copy this whole thing because we also have the code configuration type as well. So I'm just going to paste this whole thing here so that our code configuration type is indeed set to MySQL data entity MySQL EF configuration. So with that, we can go ahead and hit F6. And I'm going to, I have the logs open for my game instance 1. So I'm going to come over here, go to game instance 1, hit start service, wait a year and a half, and service is running. Awesome. So come over here, start a service. That should start that, and we should start getting notifications in our master app. And we do game server 1 started, and then in a second we should get game server 2 started. And now if we come over here, we should be able to, I don't know, hit F5 or something. I don't know, or just close it and open it back up. That works too. Alter table. No, not alter table, open table. And check that out. We now have our 2 game servers registered. So they're now entities that we can refer to with the rest of our database schema. And I'm going to go ahead and come over to game instance 1. I'm going to restart it. So wait a moment here. And I'm restarting it to make sure that it doesn't try to insert in another row. So could not game... Well... Okay, so that's going to be a problem. It seems that we still have that issue where it doesn't send that disconnect notification, but that's fine. Okay, so it restarted properly. It didn't error out, which is cool. But let's open up our data again, open table again, and make sure that we still only have those rows, and we do. Well, which we should only ever have these rows because, of course, a primary key is indeed unique. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and open up our data. Let's go ahead and create our 2 other entities. We need an entity to represent a game, and we also need an entity to represent a player in a game. It's kind of like a join table between the user's table and the game table. So I'm going to create a class, game entity. I don't like using the word game or game server for that matter, because that's such a generic term. That's why I'm putting the entity at the end of it to make it clear that this particular class represents a row in a database table. So game entity will have a public virtual int ID, which will be auto incremented, a public virtual string level name. So this game entity is going to contain or could contain quite a bit of information here. We can do things like stats, how long the game took, what level was used, what game parameters, what game type, stuff like that. All that stuff would go into this sort of game entity. We can use it both to keep track of which players are in which games, as well as doing things like statistics and leaderboards and stuff like that. So, all right, so we have our level name. We also need a reference to which server. Well, actually, we'll do public virtual, and I'm going to do a hash set here of user in-game, which is a class we haven't written yet, called players. That'll be our join table. Then I'm going to do our public virtual game server entity, and I'll just call this server. So this is going to be the server that we're currently running this game on. And that's really important, too, because I want to be able to have it for when a server restarts. Let's say a server is having issues or something. It checks to see if it had any previously running games before it died or got restarted or rebooted or whatever. And then it'll go in and it'll clear out all of those games that it was supposed to be running before to keep everything in a consistent state. So then we need a public virtual date time created at, and then a public virtual date time nullable destroyed at. So that indicates when the game stopped, when the game finished. So with that, now we can do user in-game. So user in-game represents all of the parameters that a user started with when he was in the game. So he's going to have a public virtual int ID, which isn't related to a game and isn't related to a player. The user in game is just a join table that sits in between users and game entities. Public virtual user, or how about user player? Get set. Public virtual game entity game. Get set. And then another one, public virtual boolean has abandoned. So we only want a player to be in one game at a time. So we want to make sure that when they start a new game, that we check to see if that player is in any other game. But it would be fine if he was in another game, but he abandoned that game and he's trying to start a new one. So with that, now we can do our parameters. So we need parameters to know the details of this player. Now, so, I mean, yeah, for reporting purposes or something like that. So we'll do game hero. I think I just added a reference here because that popped open. I think it just added a reference to Buzz MMO base components, but that's totally cool. And then a public virtual game team. So currently hero and team are the only two parameters a player can have at this point. All right, so with that, now we can go ahead and add this to our DB sets. So jump over into the context. We need to create a public DB set of user in game, user in games. Or do I really want to call that user in games? Users in game. That's what I want to call it. Users in game. There we go. And then our public DB set game entity, and we'll just call this games. And now let's go ahead and create our migration. So package manager console, add migration of game, or create game entity table. Hit enter. Give it a second to do a build and figure out what it's doing with its life, and we get a migration. Awesome. So here's our migration, properly indexed and all that fun stuff, foreign keys. It's awesome. So now we can come over here and say update database, and that should replicate that schema, their schema changes to our database. And it seems to have worked. Come over here just to verify, hit F5, and now we have game entities and game server entities, or game entities and users in game. Okay, so the last thing I want to do in this video is actually create... Wait a sec, am I game entity? Yeah, I have a level name. Okay. I want to create game entities and send them back into... send the generated ID back to the master server. So in the region server, the first thing we need to do is add a reference to data, which we already do. Oh yeah, we already configured all that fun stuff. So go into systems master, go into game instance system, and right here when we do begin game and it returns a game instance, which is a just describes the game, has the ID, level name, and the connection. We want to instantiate a new game entity. Now to do that, we need some sort of class that represents a currently running game. So, you know, a great name for that class would be game instance. Why did I call this game instance? This really should be like game parameters. Ugh. Huh. Naming things is hard. So we need a class that represents a currently running game. It's not going to be the actual engine. We're going to have a separate class that runs the simulation. So we're going to have... Well, we already have a game parameters class. Oh yeah, game parameters are... Yeah, okay. Let's see here. I don't know. Let's just call it running game. Why not? So we'll do a class of running game. And what do we want to put in here? What does he need? He needs the game parameters, and he'll also need a reference to something. Let's see here. So a running game, and he needs his ID. Or no, how about our running game creates... Well, no, I don't want our running games constructor to create an instance of the game entity. I really don't like the idea of instantiating a class and having that touch the database. I'd rather have that passed in. So let's think about what we want in his constructor. Obviously, he's going to need his game parameters to know how to start the game. He's also going to need a game entity. Or does he? Does he really need any information from this other than the ID of the game? Because he's already getting information about the game parameters from the game parameters class. So does he really need a reference to the whole thing, or just the ID? You know what? I'm not entirely sure. This could have to be something that I figure out at some point. I don't know exactly how I want to architect this class yet, but what I do know is that we need a way to keep track of all of the running games, and we also need a way to create those entities so that we can tell the master server what game ID was created so that we can log into that particular game from the client side. So what I'm going to do is in our game server context, for now will be responsible for handling it'll be the entry point into the game. So what I'm going to do, well, let's see here. I'm going to start off by creating a couple of private fields. We'll create a private read-only iFiber fiber and a private read-only dictionary of int and running games, and we'll call this games, and we'll go ahead and instantiate these. So games equals new dictionary of int and running game, and fiber equals new thread fiber, and fiber.start. Okay, so we need a way to create a new running game from this. Let's see. Okay, so I'm going to create a public deferred of game instance begin game, which takes in game parameters, and it'll be return fiber in queue. Also, since we have a fiber here on our game server context, down here at the bottom, I'm going to override our dispose method, which I don't think the base dispose does any. It invokes on dispose, so make sure that we still invoke base dispose, and then I'm going to do fiber.dispose as well, before I forget. Okay, so for begin game, we will open up a connection to the database, or access a database connection from the database pool. New MMO database context. And what we want to do is we want to create a game entity. So let's do that. I'm going to say var game entity equals new game entity. Created at as date time etc now. I don't know why I did created at first. I always like it at the bottom. Level name is parameters, or level name is just going to be level 1. And then server. Okay, we need a reference to the server. Now we can do that very easily by doing database.gameservers.find and then pass in config.gameserver.uniqueID. That's one way to do it. And then for players, we'll simply do players equals new hash set of user in game. And leave it like that. Ignore all the red squigglies right now. That's just because we're not returning anything from this anonymous function yet. Then I'm going to say for each var player in parameters.player details. Game entity dot players dot add new user in game. User in game will have a game set to our game entity. I don't know if that's required, but we're going to do that anyway. Player is going to be database.users.find player.id. Hero is going to be player.hero. And team is going to be player.team. Then at the end of this, we're going to do database.saveChanges. And, we have to do database. games.add game entity first, then get database save changes, and now we finally have an ID. So now at this point, I can return a new game instance, passing in an ID of game entity.id, a level name of, let's just do game entity.level name, and a Photon server connection of config.gameserver.udp connection. And for some reason, that isn't working. Return type is void. Oh, it's not fiber and queue, it's fiber and queue deferred. That's why. And there we go. That is our begin game method. So at the moment, we're not actually creating a running game yet. Once I figure out how I want to architect that, we will do that. But for now, we should be creating new game instances, and that's what we want. So with that, we should be able to go back into our system master game instance system and come down here to our begin game, and we can replace this by simply saying return server.begingame parameters. We could have also done all that logic in that little controller method, all this logic. That might have made more sense. I'm not sure. We'll figure that out later. Anyway, so now I should be able to hit F6 and we should be getting game entities created. So let's jump into Unity, hit play, wait for the database to connect. Admin lobby start. I did not get an exception, so now let's hop over into our SQL Server, jump into game entities and check that out. ID 1, level 1 created at server ID, and then in our users in-game, we do indeed have our user in the game. And if we come back here, notice how it says, well, it's not going to, I could jump into the client actually. Jump over into our game server, game instance. Who creates this again? Connect to game, creates the game server. Where's this called? Just joining game. Okay, so we'll just say starting game. In the lobby details. What? Oh, all open documents. That's not what I want. I want entire solution. Starting game. What? Is it case sensitive? Did I misspell something? Starting game. Find all. But it's literally saying that, oh, starting game without a space. Okay, I don't know why I can't find that. I'm blind. Whatever. The point is on game started, I'm simply going to say debug. Or how about connect to game, debug log, connecting to game plus game ID on server plus game dot server. I just want to make sure that the ID of the game is indeed getting propagated to the client, which it should be. So admin, create, start, and we get a connecting to game 2 on server, Photon server, blah, blah, blah. And there we go. So next up, we still have quite a bit to do actually for this. There's a lot of logic we have to handle for things like abandoning the game and so on, rules that we have to enforce to make sure that a player can't be in a game at the same time, or can't be in 2 games at once. So in the next video, we will figure that stuff out. And until then, we'll see you guys later.